thank you once again to Rapid Talks, scheduled with the Singapore FinTech Festival. I'm thrilled to be back this year for a festival that's unfortunately more virtual than physical this year. But being in the hub of FinTech innovation is a pleasure. Thrilled that our hosts have done such a great job of bringing the world to Singapore's door, and excited to continue to bring Singapore's FinTech community and Asia's FinTech community at large to the global stage. With me here is Rahul Shingal, a co-founder of TazaPay, someone I've known for more than a decade at this point as a thought leader in the financial services online space and the e-commerce space. He comes with a tremendous depth of expertise. I think I've told him before, but I will tell him again for the camera. One of the reasons I'm in Asia is because of his thought leadership around mobile payments and how he told the story about what's so exciting about Asian payments a decade ago, and that inspired me to move out here and become part of the journey. So thank you for that. So with that said, for folks who haven't already participated in one of our talks before, can you tell us a little bit about what TazaPay is and the problem that you were solving for?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so happy that I was able to inspire you in some part to come to Asia. I think the Asian fintech scene is better off because of you. First with your time at Grab and now with Rapid. TazaPay, I'll start with the problem statement. And I was seeing this problem very closely with PayPal along with you, that what PayPal did for B2C, that there was an inherent trust created between transacting parties, that if something goes wrong, there is some level of recourse. And later on, Stripe and a lot of the B2C players were able to really nail this trust issue in cross-border transaction. You don't necessarily nowadays think when you're using a card, what happens if the seller doesn't deliver or the seller doesn't deliver as per the specification. This problem is still there in B2B. And trust is singularly missing. And there are multiple ways in which these customers deal with this. They'll either go and meet each other, they'll do advance payments, sample shipments, or they use these arcane methods called letter of credit. So this was the central thesis, this trust is missing and there is need for a trusted intermediary, or more generically a resolution and a protection framework for B2B transactions. We started with that thesis. We're very lucky to get funded. We started with a pure escrow service, a digital escrow service.
So how long ago did you start the company?
We started last year in 2020, April timeframe. I was at Stripe before this and April was my last day. So started that. Initially got the funding from a couple of leading investors like Sequoia and Saison Capital, build a prototype. So it's been about 1.5 years in the journey now. I have two other co-founders, Arul, who you know well, our CTO, and Saroj. And now we've got a fairly reasonably sized team, about 45 people, 25 engineers, and then rest, other functions like compliance, product, and all that good stuff. So that was the central thesis, that we'll solve for trust in cross-border. And we started with an escrow service, which allowed a buyer and seller to come to our platform, codify the terms of the trade, very simple template, create the escrow agreement. And then with payment providers like Rapid, we were able to make payments very simple. If the buyer is in the US, we collect the money locally. The buyer is in Europe, we collect the money locally. That to us was actually not the main product. That was more of a convenience factor, that if you've done an escrow, don't do a wire transfer to Singapore where we hold the money, but you can transfer it locally. And I'm telling you that story because that became an essential part of our pivot later. So we launched the escrow for SMBs. Initial response was a bit lukewarm. And the reason it was lukewarm is we'd made it very complicated. We had an extremely lengthy form, too many fields, too many things to enter, too many documents. We were thinking B2B is complex and we need to capture all this data. And then we quickly pivoted and completely simplified it, took away all the bells and whistles and just simplified it to the core. Simple way of creating escrow. Assuming most people will be doing it on mobile. Simple way of collecting payments, and that started taking off.
And so simplification, sorry to interrupt, but simplification in terms of the form got simpler, or the actual value proposition you're offering is also watered down in some way?
The actual value proposition also got watered down in some way. So we had and that's a great question. We had a picture of the ideal customer. We had done a lot of customer interviews, and we had a picture of an ideal customer who was a reasonably sophisticated exporter or importer. Somebody who's been in the business, does $15 to $20 million of volume, And we looked at their processes of what all they need to do, what documents they need, what kind of data is required. It turned out that is not our ideal customer. Our customer was a bit smaller and a bit more casual. And all they needed was a simple form, simpler documentation. And to some extent, we started catering to slightly smaller customers and also lower value. And surprisingly, we also started seeing expansion of our use cases from purely being import-export to services and freelance services, where inherently the customer is a bit more tech savvy. So that was a big learning. The big learning, and this is for anybody who's founding a company, when you do a customer interview before you actually put a product out, there is a focus problem. You tell them, is this a problem? And because you focus them on the problem, and in many cases you paid them to come for an interview, they will focus on that problem and they'll make you believe that that's a problem. But when you actually have the product out there, that problem is not even among the top 5. It is one of the good to have problems. So I think deciphering that can only happen once you have a product out there. So actually my sense is these customer interviews that we did spend months and months on these customer interviews with limited utility. We should have trusted our gut.
There you go, place to start.
So that was a big part of our journey. And then we pivoted, simplified it. We started seeing expansion of use cases. And at the same time, we were expanding our payment network for local collections and local disbursements. Rapid's a big part of it, but we also got other partners to help us with local collections. And so we built a pretty fairly reasonable, and it's all optimized ground up for B2B. What we also realized was a lot of these payment methods are not optimized for B2B. Business payments are not allowed, limits are there, they're not amenable for recurring payments, you can tokenize them. And as a result, a lot of marketplaces and B2B e-commerce platforms came to us and said that this is great, we need this. So we opened up our APIs and allowed them to integrate with us. And that's, I think, where we feel we've found product market fit in creating escrow as a service product, completely API driven, skinless for e-commerce merchants and marketplaces who are doing B2B cross-border. So that's kind of where our focus is now. We have a direct to SMB product on our dashboard. It's there, but we don't focus on it that much. That's like more of a showcase. Anyway, both our products use the same API stack. So we become our internal clients for that API stack.
And so these marketplaces, are they also professional services and freelancers and a small mix of SMBs, or has the seller mix changed as well?
So we've seen majority of them are services, to be honest, largely freelance based and consultancy services. But we see a heavy concentration of these B2B cross-border sellers in agri, commodity and engineering. And this is quite a remarkable thing which is happening. This is our thesis also, that majority of B2B commerce will move online and will move to platforms like it happened in B2C. And that's happening. You see local heroes in each vertical. We have a customer who just does nuts and bolts and fasteners. He's just a local hero in that. It's a company called Engineering Edge, and they're just superstars in nuts and bolts and fasteners. Every seller who does nuts and bolts and fasteners sells on that platform. Same thing you have for commodities. We have one who only does fishes, for instance, in Vietnam. So that's where we are finding that, unlike in Alibaba in China, which is all encompassing, or in Amazon, in this part of the world, it will not be a winner take all. They will be vertical specific, and they all need a protected payment service and escrow as a service payment. And so that's why we are starting to find product market fit.
And are these escrows, escrow can have multiple legs to it. Are you finding these to be simple kind of one-step escrows, or something that's a little more complicated over a longer period of time?
That's a great question. That was also a big learning, that seldom is a payment in B2B like B2C is one milestone payment. Typically, there are 3 or 4 milestones. There's an advance payment, some payment on delivery, some payment on shipment. So we've spent a lot of time in creating these milestone-based payments, where we can take the payment and have different conditionality for release on each of these payments. So catering and customizing these milestones is actually a big part of our product proposition.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing, so knowing that Web 3.0 is the buzzword of the week for sure, are you seeing any of these marketplaces trying to tokenize the underlying good? Are you seeing any reflection of a crypto angle or a blockchain angle to these marketplaces, or not yet?
Not at all. I mean, not yet isn't not at all. It's like not even in the
You
conversation.
can edit that out.
That's right. It's, I think blockchain and DeFi has a great role to play. Just a lot of ecosystem players have to come together to make it happen. And I often joke that I think I'll have a full head of hair before all of these things come together.
Fish as a service.
That's a fish as a service. So we haven't seen this. I think we are blockchain ready as and when it happens, we'll be an active participant on the node. The first step is for them to go to Web 2.0 before they go to Web 2.3.
Fair enough. Fair enough. If you go to the other maybe piece of your value proposition, there's a piece that's around validating the buyer and seller, the parties. What about validating the goods? I mean, what's the trust relationship you have to build to create a defensible position for your business?
That's a great question. From the very beginning, even before we launched our payment service, we had a validation service, and that's been growing on its own. We've added new sources of data, and we've got a full team of 5 people who do this now. So that's been quite valuable, not only for our SMBs, for our marketplaces as well. They can outsource it. The goods validation has been a bit more challenging because unless there's a physical inspection, there's just no way to talk about the authenticity of the item. So in any of e-commerce, there are 2 types of dispute mechanism. There is INR, item not received, and significantly not as described, as you well know. So our initial take is on item not received, that we'll make sure that the item is shipped. If the buyer wants to validate the veracity of the items, then they need to order an inspection. So we've tied up with inspection companies who can go and do the actual inspection and add a certificate. It's a bit more manual than I thought it would be. We're trying to figure out how to automate it, but also because we are pivoting a bit more towards the platforms. In many cases, these platforms and e-commerce sellers and marketplaces themselves, that's a big part of their value proposition.
And their value proposition onboarding good sellers, or do they have an inspection component to what they do?
Some of them have an inspection component as well. So they'll send a physical person, and when the shipping is being done, they'll take pictures, etc. It's still very rudimentary, but it's much better than just playing blind. It's been especially in markets like Vietnam and Thailand and India.
Interesting. So it actually is very complementary because they have an industry-specific validation.
That's right.
You have a more generic one.
That's right.
You can lock up the payment to provide the payment.
Absolutely.
Interesting. How has your team evolved as you've had this pivot? Is it the same sales guy, same team, or have you had to seek out different types of people?
Thankfully, we had not hired a sales team before we did it, because initially my thought was it'll be product-led growth. I've been groomed and trained in value-based companies. It's all the customers will come organically. So I had trained myself that way, and a lot of our product thinking was that way. That didn't happen. A lot of customers require hand-holding. We do a lot of SEM and SEO and good stuff in generating leads, but there's a salesperson who needs to close it. So we are not invested in direct SMB sales. So the new teams we are hiring are all e-commerce sales professionals who know APIs, who understand e-commerce, who understand user experience, value prop, etc.
And do you find your product is going to be easy enough that a virtual Salesforce or an SMB-oriented Salesforce will be able to sell it? Or will you going to have to lean in on more complex integration and more complex selling for this marketplace use case in particular?
I think it'll be the latter. We'll have to have more complex. We've also used channels like, we've got plugins for WooCommerce and Magento and Shopify, etc. So those are a bit more self-serve. But invariably, we are seeing, even if it's a small marketplace, there is a salesperson required, because just the workflows are so complex. Milestones, how money will be released, what will be conditionality, what's the dispute process. So there's at some point, we'll be able to productize it. Right now, we are able to manage. We have a target of getting to about 500 marketplaces. So we think we'll be able to do it with brute force for now, very honestly. And we think about more scalable ways of acquisition later.
Uncomfortable reality sometimes.
That's right.
Cool. And how now that we're possibly getting to the end of the beginning of the pandemic era, how's your team evolved? How have you managed the team?
That's right.
Where are people working?
Yeah. You and I, we managed large teams for many, many years. And I found it's a completely different leadership style when your teams are remote. thankfully in Singapore we've been coming to office and we can create the same level of camaraderie. And I think that was a bit of a miss on our side. We have a very large team in India, engineers and operations team. And creating the same sense of engagement, same sense of involvement is a lot harder when the teams are remote. And to be honest, a lot of us are not even trained in doing this well. Doing a all hands once in 2 weeks, and it doesn't cut it. And so I think that's been a learning journey for us. I think where we've been successful is over engagement, documenting things as thoroughly as you can, trying to set context as much as you can, having more one-on-one sessions. But it's very, to be honest, I'd say I'm still learning. I'm a novice at this, of how to manage a remote workforce.
I think we're all novices at this.
Yeah.
How is the intellectual and emotional energy level of the team? I'm going to say exhaustion, but you can tell me it's not exhausted at all.
Yeah.
It's doing great, but it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
How are we in terms of being able to have gas in the tank for another couple of months?
I think people are very close to being at that point where they're burning out. It's just sitting at home and whole day sitting in front of Zoom is not productive at all. We've tried every single tool out there to create engagement, but very difficult. In Singapore, I think it's much easier. You can still come to office and have, every week the rules change, as you know. So I think the teams are reaching that point where they're feeling the burnout. So
we sent around a happy hour box to people a month ago or so. And this particular box had 9 drinks, each one with a different hour of the day, starting early in the morning. We're like, this is definitely telling you something about where the industry is at if people are starting to drink at 9 a.m.
That's right.
On a Tuesday.
But what's your experience with this?
I think same thing, right? We have tried a lot of things, right? And as the market has evolved in terms of what we could and couldn't do, we've adapted, I think, pretty faithfully to the market. But we went through the TED Talk era. We went through everyone's training each other. We went through the drinking era. We went through all these things. And now I think we're at the point of now people are saying, you know what, let's dial it all down to the bare minimum, focus on productivity, focus on just a limited amount of high quality communication. Because some of the other stuff, people are just feeling it's a little bit done.
That's right.
That said, we have a lot of folks who've joined the team who have coming from companies where they had no interaction with people. They haven't been in an office in over a year. And I think the fact they're coming into a team that has tried really hard to be engaged for a long time, I hope they find it very refreshing. It's actually better than what they've seen in other places. But at the same time, operating at this level is, I think, exhausting for all of us.
That's right.
In addition to a startup thing, I don't think I've had a real vacation in quite a long time. So now I'm going home for December.
Lovely. VTL.
Just dreaming about the period of time of unplugging
right.
and really spending some quality time with the family, despite the fact that we're all at home anyway. And there's just something different about the burnout that we're at this point.
That's right.
But hopefully we're, as you and I said, we're both had our boosters.
Triple vaccinated.
So we're hoping we're very close to the end here.
That's right.
Cool. What have you seen about the industry, right? Knowing that you're part of the old guard, and obviously an industry that wasn't very cool 10 years ago is particularly cool right now. What are some of the things that you've seen come along that are inspiring to you?
That's right. That's a pretty insightful question. So let me give it a little bit of a thought. I think what's inspiring is it used to be very difficult for a company like ours. We've been able to get operational in about 54 markets with payment partners in several markets. We can collect locally in Africa, disperse in so many markets. This 10 years ago would have taken about 3 to 4 years. Now, because of the modular nature, and there are so many partners that you can work with, it's become much easier. So the journey of setting up a product has become much easier. The quality of tools available there is much better. I don't have to reinvent fraud management. I don't have to reinvent sanction screening, AML. All that is there, modular. So it's about putting the jigsaw pieces together. So that has been very inspiring. And for any kind of a deep problem, there's somebody there to to help you solve it. The flip side of it is if it's so easy, then what's your entry barrier? But I think entry barrier is putting all this together in a way which can be seamlessly consumed by a consumer, by a customer. And the other thing is the regulatory setup. I think it used to be incredibly hard, very insular, most regulators. And especially for cross-border, I think there's a general realization that you can't over-regulate as long as you have sufficient regulation in a few jurisdictions, you are able to offer cross-border services globally. I hope it stays like that for your sake and my sake, but I think that's been fairly inspiring. And third, I think the most important, I do not think 10 years ago I would have been able to assemble a team like this so easily. Nowadays, there's a much bigger appetite for people to try out a startup. The ecosystem is mature. It was always there in Silicon Valley. In the Valley, you could collect really quality talent because people felt that, okay, even if this doesn't work, there's another option. This will add value to my CV. So, and especially in India, the quality of engineers we are able to attract because we are doing interesting, cool stuff. I think it's been very inspiring. Otherwise, it was very difficult to pull people from good companies 6-7 years ago.
And I think in the India case, where the market is pretty notorious for having a very fickle workforce and short tenures and people going on to the next job, do you think COVID has actually helped you retain people? Because it's harder for them to get a second job or a different job?
On the contrary, it's so easy right now, especially on engineering talent. There are so many startups in India and so many unicorns and decacorns now. That hasn't...
Everyone's office is the same because it's your bedroom.
It's home, yeah, exactly. So it's... what has become easier is they can work from anywhere. We have engineers in remote parts of India right now, places like Assam and all that. They have fiber optic connectivity and it works. So that's been fairly heartening. But yeah, the competition has only increased for the engineers.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the previous point, which is the barriers to entry to build and scale a startup are so much lower. If you know what you're trying to do, you can assemble the pieces. Yeah. And one of the things that I've found very inspiring is to have a generation of people now who have grown up this way over the last 6-7 years and are looking to create new things. And they're looking horizontally for inspiration, looking at neighboring countries for inspiration, and really progressively moving the ball forward. It's one of the things I love about working in Asia is there's so many optimistic people who are saying, hey, like, we can do it. Let's make it happen. They're not looking necessarily for very distant inspiration. They're inspired locally and they take action, right, which I think is quite great. And obviously working here, we also have the advantage of an inspirational regulator and an ecosystem of people. But I think across the board, almost any country you can find at least a little bit of that right now, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Cool. So what are you excited for the next 6 months? And what are some of the things you're working on right now?
We've just, I think, arrived at product market fit. So product market fit, I was reading this article, is 3 journeys. There's a product market fit desert, where in a desert you have no idea where you're heading. You're trying things. So I think we've just crossed the desert and at the foothill of this product market fit. So very excited about climbing that mountain and scaling and getting the first few hundred customers, scaling our TPV, really getting a team to a reasonable size. We will always be, in the near term, we'll be focused on Southeast Asia, India, connecting Southeast Asia, India sellers to the rest of the world buyers. Southeast Asia, India is very complex in terms of disbursement to sellers. This whole host of compliance. India, has OPGSP. Vietnam has its own version. So that's where our moat will be in not only doing the checkout and the escrow as a service, but compliant way of settling funds with the proper documentation, etc. So that's, I think, where our moat is. So we'll nail that in the next 6 to 8 months. And then look for other emerging markets to nail. So we would like to be a emerging market story for sellers connecting to developed market buyers. So Middle East, Africa would be our next port of call. We are also launching buyer credit in partnership with an underwriting company in the US. And the thesis is that credit is much cheaper in the US. So the seller can offer the buyer credit at US interest rates, while essentially the seller gets credit in a way. So it's an interest rate arbitrage. That seems to have a lot of demand, so we're integrating that. So that scaling will take some time, but we'll do it in partnership with our marketplace customers. So those are the 2 or 3 main things that I'm most excited
There's
about.
always demand for business credit.
Yes.
Evergreen
That's right.
category.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, it's been great having you. Look forward to see you again next year and hearing more about the awesome growth of TazaPay. And as you take over the region and provide this service globally, I think there's a lot of exciting stories you're going to be able to tell.
That's right. And thank you for your support, Joel. Specifically you and Rapid. You gave us such a platform to build something, and without having to worry about so many things. You've given us a platform to grow, so and TazaPay will forever be grateful to Rapid.
It's a great pleasure. Supporting great entrepreneurs is what we're supposed to do. So
Thank you so
glad
much.
to do it.
Thank you
very
so much. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
And thanks for joining. Look forward to seeing you next time.